welcome to this photo manipulation tutorial where I will show you how I created this giant taking a snooze on a building in downtown anywhere. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to show you the base image, just a shot of downtown somewhere with heavy sunlight. And noticing some shadows, and noticing here with that little edge, you can tell where the sun is coming from. So just going to take note of that before I do the picture of myself. And also noticing perspective lines. So that one didn't really come into play, but this one, you can tell how it is like sloping towards the left, sloping down, that is. So here is that picture I took of myself. So I've got a coffee table, put a blanket over top of that just so I can capture those shadows. Notice that that angle is fairly accurate, that slopes down towards the left, following that perspective. That other angle, like I said, didn't really come into play. I had to put a laundry basket underneath my knee for support. So that created a little bit of an issue, which I tried to fix. And noticing this light, got a light right there. It's going way up, trying to mimic the sun, which is coming down like that. So I've also got like a little incidental light there in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and select myself with the quick selection tool. Probably a better idea would have been to use the pen tool, but use whatever method you are comfortable with. So I'm going to create a layer mask. This little icon that looks like that, it's located right there. That's just so you can go back and make corrections if your selection was not to your liking. I'm going to move myself around here and try to scale myself to where I think I should be according to what I originally had in my head. So noticing this area here where my knee is just sort of floating, there's nothing supporting my knee there. So I'm going to hit Control T, Command T on Mac, and scale myself down. Holding down Shift, you can scale that proportionally perfect. So I've got myself in place there, and to try to fix that knee floating issue, notice this little building here. I'm going to try to copy that, build that up to the point where it's right underneath my knee. So you can see this little area that I'm selecting too much towards the left there. So you can use the lasso selection tool, holding down Alt or Option on Mac, and selecting this part you don't want selected. And then it sort of clips right to that edge of the building. So I'm going to hit Control J and make a copy of that and call that something, more building. And I'm going to put that right underneath. It's got the same color, so blends in a little bit, not perfect. Got some issues with those trees I'll try to fix later. But you can see it's not tall enough, not even remotely close. So I'm going to create a copy of that and just call that more building. I'm going to move that right on top of where we just were. And you can tell that it's still not going to work. And yet what you can do, I'll zoom in here and just push the top of it up, just kind of cheat a little. You do that too much and the proportions are not going to look right, but I think it looks just fine. So right up against my knee there. You can see these issues with the trees sort of creating this pattern where it's kind of obvious what you've done. So I'm going to take the clone stamp tool, and I'm not going to go through every single part of this, but you can select a certain area where there's not tree and try to slowly but surely get rid of that, just so it doesn't look as much like a pattern that you have just copied those buildings. Didn't completely get rid of all of those trees. When you at home have like 500 hours you can spend on this type of thing, then you can make it absolutely perfect, but just showing you that this can be done. So I've got another copy of that same section. You can tell my foot is just kind of floating out there in nowhere land, and I'm going to put that right underneath. This doesn't really look good, but later I'm going to cover up this little problem area. Sometimes when doing these photo manipulations, it's tough to avoid problem areas, so every now and then you got to do that. So what I'm doing here is you can clip this hue and saturation adjustment layer to me, because I was looking a little too saturated. So just to blend in better with those buildings that are not very saturated, can take the saturation of me down. That looks good right there. So I'm going to go down a little bit with that. Helps blend into that background. And going to borrow the design or the shape of these shadows. You can tell there's really two shadows, a dark one right underneath the arm and a larger one, but that angle of how it curves from my arm, I'm going to try to copy that. So that really wouldn't have been possible without me putting the blanket down in order to catch that light as to how that shadow is going to look. So I'm going to use a brush with 100% black, because I will just mess with the opacity later and create a shadow here of the arm. So I'm going to try to make sure I've got a little bit of a wiggle when I pull this down so that it's not a straight line. And I'm going to go in and just completely fill this in, speed this up a little bit. So that is looking perfect. No more to do. You've got a perfect shadow, right? Or you can go in and mess with the opacity, reducing the opacity back and forth, and doing that in combination with the gradient tool. But first I'm going to use the blur tool and kind of blur the edges as it gets further away from the subject. Each shadow really should have less definition. So you've got, I'm going to create a blurry edge there to the shadow. I'm going to create a layer mask on that shadow using the gradient tool to make sure that this is selected top left. Gradient from black to white. And I'm going to show this again where I'm hitting at the bottom, clicking at the bottom, moving up, creates a gradient, allowing the shadow just sort of naturally fall off there in intensity. So creating a second shadow, crank up the opacity on that. So really in creating shadows, you should try to create at least two to get a more realistic look. So this second one will be much darker, much smaller. So started off at 100%, reducing the opacity to kind of blend those two, the darker one and that one we've already done that falls down the building. and reducing the opacity to your liking. Creating another layer for the shadow for the second arm. And really doing the same thing. I keep forgetting about the opacity, so cranking that up to 100. And also a good idea to go back to the original photo for a reference of how that shadow should look. And reducing that opacity a little bit. So already starting to look sort of like I am actually lying down on that building. So creating another shadow for the arm. So the second shadow, the darker shadow. So obviously a much smaller, much thinner shadow that is just really right up against your subject. And reducing that opacity. And just sort of going back in and refining it. Some refining touches. Creating another layer and going to create another shadow. So creating a shadow for this leg area. So you can click in one area and then hold down shift, click in another, create a straight line. Not sure why I created a straight line. But anyway, fill in that entire area and then reducing the opacity. Creating another layer, of course, for right underneath the knee area. So I've got a really small, soft brush, and the shadow is underneath the layer of myself. So there's no danger in, I guess, marking up or above on the knee. And then reducing that opacity. Sometimes it's good to start at 0 and just work your way up and just kind of eyeball it, like what looks realistic. And creating another shadow for the foot. This one didn't look as good, but like I said earlier, I'm gonna cover that up. This little problem area of the foot and the buildings that are kind of floating. But you can take a really soft eraser and just kind of fix that shadow area, even though I'm going to cover it up later. So creating another layer here. I'm going to create a tree, going to filter, render, and tree. Trying to pick out a tree that looks like that one that is on the bottom right of the screen. So this is just a really good way of fixing a problem area. And that looks perfect. No more reason to proceed. You're done. Obviously, hit Control-T, reduce the size, reduce the scale of that tree, and you can always warp it a little bit. But goal here is covering up that little issue. So reducing the size again. Obviously, you could painstakingly go through the process of selecting an actual tree to make it look even better, but this is just a quick way. Maybe if it's not a prominent section of your image, this would work, and covering that up. Plus, it also kind of sets me back in there more, because there's something over top of me. So got an image of a crack on a wall, and I'm going to try to manipulate that. You can change the blend modes, changing that to darker. Still has some issues. I'm going to go back to normal. Create an adjustment curves. Clip it to only affect that crack, and you're holding down Alt, going in between those two, and clicking your mouse or pen tablet. I'm going to create this sort of S curve to create more of a contrast, so that when I apply that different blending mode of darken, it will kind of get rid of more of that extra stuff other than the crack that we really don't want. But some of that stuff could look realistic, as in texture that is on the building. I'm going to go ahead and rotate that, just hitting Control T or Command T on Mac. Rotating that crack so that it is going downward into the building. Obviously there would be some damage if I really did decide to take a snooze on these buildings. Wouldn't be able to potentially handle my weight. So getting a crack, putting that probably where my right arm, elbow, shoulder area has hit that building. So getting that into place. And erasing part of that crack that extends above into my arm so that it only starts right at that top portion of the building. So I've got another wall crack here. It's got more issues in that a lot more texture to get rid of, but like I say, it could blend in. Here's a case where I forgot to clip it to only affect the crack, so hold down Alt, click in between those two. Then that curves adjustment only affects that crack layer. Set it to darken. You've got quite a few extraneous texture areas. I'm gonna hit Control T and then rotate this so that it is more vertical. I'm gonna hit my eraser tool and just kind of destructively get rid of these harsh edges and some of that texture. So obviously I could have spent a lot more time refining that, but then sizing that downward and also putting that on the building. You can also reduce the opacity of that crack to make it look more realistic, as if it's blending into the building. I'm just going to copy paste, Control C, Control V. You can also click with the Move tool, holding down Alt, and it'll create a copy, but Control C, Control V also works. I'm going to have a curves adjustment on the background. I'm going to bring this brightness all the way down and hit Control I to create an inverse of that. Then what you can do is with a brush, black or white brush, you can start to reveal some of that darkness. So with the white brush, white reveals, black conceals with these layer masks. And reduce the opacity, and it stands to reason there would be quite a bit of shadow, damage right where my hip is kind of digging into the building there, so loss of detail, etc. You can also use the burn and dodge tools. This is just one way of doing it. So I've got another crack, just copy paste. I'm going to erase the part that goes up into my knees just so that and that little left side of it, just so that it starts right where my knee hit the building. And decided to go back later and refine this shadow of my left arm, especially that thumb area. That starts to look a little more realistic there. And you can decide to put a color grade on it if you want, but I think we are pretty much done. So that's how you create, I'm gonna go ahead and save it. That's how you create a giant that has fallen asleep on a building in downtown somewhere. So be sure and like and subscribe and stay tuned for more videos. Thanks for watching.